Welcome, everyone, to tonight's conversation entitled The Language of Objects. This is the latest in the Academy's series of interdisciplinary conversations. And this year's theme is patronage. This is our theme both in Rome and New York. And our two speakers today are going to engage issues of patronage writ large, issues of patronage in the sense of the ways in which fashion tells stories about identity, taste, gender, and self-expression. Our conversation today is between Susan Sellers and Hérica Valladares. Susan Sellers is with us as the Henry Wolf graphic designer in residence at the American Academy in Rome. She is a designer in New York City who works across disciplines with a particular focus, excuse me, I'm a little congested, on identity, exhibitions, and public spaces. She's a founding partner at the design firm 2x4 and the former director of design at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And her current project that she's working on now investigates materials and forms of display across time and political ideologies. Hérica Valladares is here as our current Esther Van Deman Scholar in Residence, and she's also a 2009 Rome Prize winner. She's Associate Professor of Classics at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Hérica is the author of numerous articles and essays on Roman wall painting, the history of archaeological exploration in the Bay of Naples, and the reception of classical antiquity in the early modern period. Her book, Painting, Poetry, and the Invention of Tenderness in the Early Roman Empire, was published by Cambridge University Press in 2021. Excuse me again. While in Rome, she's working on a new monograph whose current title is Fashioning Empire, Roman Women and Their Objects. I think we're going to hear a little bit about that today. And Susan and Hérica have really dove into this collaboration. I think it's going to be a really exciting conversation and presentation today. And they have collaborated on a multifaceted and deeply interdisciplinary presentation on the relationship among objects, especially fashion, identity in terms of gender and women, constructions of femininity, and social position. They look at fashion as a form of social history and as a form of historical memory of women's lives. They will encourage us to see fashion and the objects associated with fashion as a sort of archive, as a location of memory, as a way to think about women's desires and women's self-fashioning. Hérica will present first, and then Susan, and then we will share some ideas emerging from the presentation, and then we will turn it over to audience questions, and then finally we will all go upstairs to the cortile for a reception. So with that, welcome to Susan and Hérica.
Susan, do you want to stand up for a minute, just so for those of you who do not know us yet already, I'm Hérica and this is Susan. And thank you, Marla, for that introduction. Thank you for engineering this collaboration between Susan and me. It's been a joy to work with Susan. I have learned so much, I hope we can continue. Susan and I can continue this conversation in other venues, and I'm very much excited, we're very much excited, Susan and I, to open up the conversation to you guys once we stop this kind of carousel of presentations that we're going to start now. So I will begin by talking a little bit about the sort of conceptual theoretical framework that Susan and I have been thinking about in merging together our work, right? So this presentation that we're sharing with you today began as a series of lively exchanges between Susan and me, first on Zoom and then here at the Academy in person. Although Susan's work is rooted in the contemporary world and my research is centered on the ancient Roman Empire, we found that we share a fundamental interest in what we describe or define as the language of objects. What drives our work is a series of interrelated questions regarding the communicative, narrative power of objects. Objects embody stories through their form, materials, and uses. So how do objects speak, and to whom? How are the object's stories and messages modified or inflected through the use, forms of display, and even the sites in which we first encounter them? These are very broad questions that could be approached in a variety of ways. But for Susan and for me, these questions are part of the interpretive frame through which we approach a specific category of objects, namely objects related to the world of women's fashion. Fashion has long been perceived as a lowbrow, unserious, trivial pursuit, seen more as a craft or artisanal skill than an art. Fashion has historically been relegated to the less exalted realm of analysis and interpretation, and this is of course changing now, but it is undeniable that fashion's transience, its ephemerality, along with its association with consumerism, have made it seem like a less valuable, less significant form of expression. At the same time, and this is yet another point of contact, of connection between Susan's work and mine, fashion was, and still is, a powerful means for shaping and communicating messages about identity and status. Fashion also represents something more intangible, an individual's or even a community's desires, aspirations, and ideals. Fashion is then a window onto a fantasy world that sheds important light on the lived reality of individuals in a particular historical period. Fashion is both a narrative representational medium and an archive of often untold stories, especially stories about individuals that are either silenced or unrepresented in more traditional historical documents and accounts. So, before I hand things over to Susan, I want to tell you a little bit about the project that I'm working on here at the American Academy in Rome this fall, which Marla mentioned briefly in her introduction. So this is my current book project, which is titled, at least for now, those of you who have published books know that publishing houses like to mess with your titles. So for now, at least, according to me, this book is called Fashioning Empire, Roman Women and Their Objects, and it analyzes objects of daily use that were produced primarily or exclusively for women in the Roman world. Often referred to in Latin as the mundus muliebris, or women's apparel, articles related to the care of the self, which included not only clothing and shoes, but also jewelry, cosmetics, and specially trained slaves, were seen in antiquity as an essentially feminine concern. In fact, according to Roman law, items from the mundus muliebris were always considered the woman's property in the event of a divorce or the husband's demise. A close study of these objects and their visual representation in Roman art prompts us to ask new questions and tell new stories about the lives of women in the ancient world. Recent studies have analyzed the cultural and economic exchanges between Rome and its provinces through the lens of public architecture, funerary practices, and consumption patterns, especially as these patterns are reflected in ancient foodways. Most of these studies, however, have not sufficiently emphasized questions of gender and status. In what ways did non-aristocratic and non-elite women participate in the Mediterranean-wide process of Romanization? And how were their lives impacted by these political, cultural, and economic changes? Drawing on my training in classical literature, art history, and archaeology, my book offers a synthetic, interdisciplinary study of objects and works of art that have been marginalized in the current research on Roman imperialism. As I argue in this project, the articles from the Mundus Muliebris are invaluable documents that communicate the realities, ideals, and aspirations of women living in the Roman Empire. Produced from materials originating from far-flung geographical regions, these objects offer concrete evidence of the profound and widespread impact of contemporary trade routes and networks on women's everyday life. The visual representations of these objects in Rome and elsewhere also show how ideals and concepts traveled along with material imports, transforming the ways in which individuals defined and presented themselves in an increasingly diverse, socially stratified world. So we'll tell you more about this in a few minutes, but now it's Susan's turn.
Hi, thank you, Erica and Marla, for putting Erica and I together. And this has been such a fun experiment to try to bring these worlds together under the rubric of fashion. Marla introduced my studio and my role. I'm creative director and designer. My studio, 2x4, works across disciplines, so design, media, brand strategy, identity, exhibition, and architecture. It is interdisciplinary, and also across sectors, so across cultural and commercial sectors, working with institutions and organizations and with artists, but also with technology and retail. But objects are often the center of my work, and I've been interested in the secret stories that are embedded in objects of all sorts, buildings, artworks, designed objects, utilitarian objects that we surround ourselves with every day. And I'm especially interested in the ways that design gives them a voice and creates the shape and expresses these stories. So it's a kind of form of inquiry for me, an exploration, and an interface to explore the world. For me, just to give you a sense, I mean, I see design as a verb. It's like it's a language, it's a medium, and it's a method. And this language comprises typography, color, images, movement, film and video, animation, architecture and space and the way we move through it, interactive and image technologies, and inevitably participation and audiences. And so I try to conjure up new meanings and perspectives and share ideas through these kind of extra linguistic means. And I look to visualize things that can't be seen or are lost or hidden or inaccessible or unclear, looking in particular for the implicit contradictions in these things, not to resolve them, but to make them kind of sentient and explicit, to make them kind of compelling, to ask questions, and always looking to give equal credence to information, quote unquote, and then to evocation and intuition. And I'm always trying to both imagine an audience for this work and also create one. So the goal is to create an environment that asks questions about these objects, that inspires, that provokes curiosity, sometimes confusion, and ultimately alternate points of view about the world, about like the constructs in which we understand objects and what they mean to us. So just to draw on and curate my own work to relate a little bit specifically to Hérica's, this is an exhibition that we designed at 2x4 for Nike of 100 objects from Nike's archive to tell the story of its pursuit of lightness in its product design and its impact on the performance of athletes. These artifacts in the exhibition, they're prototypes, they're points of inspiration, they're models, they're interviews with designers and athletes, they're old advertisements, all of these things that start to piece together what the story of the design of these objects are. The exhibition took place actually at the 2008 Olympics in Beijing, located in 798, the neighborhood 798. And it was intended to introduce the brand to the mainland Chinese audience formally for the first time, though I suspect obviously it was pretty well known before that point. And the exhibition also included all kinds of ways to experience and understand these objects firsthand through hands-on experiments, modeling, a film series, a podcast, and a design competition with the students at CAFA, which is the renowned art school in Beijing, and an exhibition of that work. So it was incredibly, interactive and experiential. But alternatively, and on another side, this is a project and exhibition that I led at the Met called Manus Ex Machina, Design in an Age of Technology. It was the 2014 exhibition for the Costume Institute, the annual exhibition that accompanies the Met Gala. And it was devoted to design and technology, the history of haute couture and ready-to-wear, and the ways that those categories have blurred with increasing interest in incorporating a whole host of digital technologies into the design and production process. So this narrative started with the explication of the trades, the kind of fashion trades in Diderot's encyclopedia. In this kind of rotunda, you can see the books behind this guy that outlined the métiers of tailoring, folding, pleating, to leatherwork, beading, silk flower making, and includes dresses from Poiret and Chanel to Issey Miyake to Martin Margiela, Hussein Chalayan, to Karl Lagerfeld and this incredible heat-bonded neoprene wedding dress that has no seams, and also this 25-foot-long train that is both digitally printed and hand beaded. The curation of this exhibition was by Andrew Bolton, and I led the creative vision for the show with the Met design team, which is substantial, and Office for Metropolitan Architecture show Shigamasu, to design this kind of ghost cathedral that sits inside the Lehman wing of the Met, if you know it, and sort of mirrors the classical proportions of that architecture, which is, and the premise was that, in fact, fashion, or that design and technology isn't so much futuristic as it is romantic, a kind of romantic conceit. So we created this environment under what was a lot of daylight, frankly, to house these historical objects, and to create this incredibly pure, soft, luminous, honorific space to display them, that was also built entirely with common materials. So steel street scaffolding, heat bonded scrim, and then projection mapped with animation to elaborate and animate the detail and the handwork and the labor that goes into the handcraft on a lot of these engineered and kind of digitally fabricated objects, and kind of seamlessly integrated into the surface of this Ghost Cathedral. And the project was really meant to mediate this opposition between the handmade and the manufactured, between high and low culture, between roughness and refinement, and between labor and mechanical production. So the larger thing that connects and that I look for in my work is this question of how designers operate in the world. What are they saying and how and to what end? And so this project asked that question of the New York design community, crowdsourcing their responses in screens in Times Square and across the city on billboards and taxi TV, for instance, when there were taxis in New York City. And this was one of my favorite responses from that piece, and it was think through things. And so that is really kind of my mantra in my own work, and it's what we're going to speak today. So that just is an introduction to kick off our conversation and start some object stories.
All right, so thinking through things, we decided, Susan and I, to divide the rest of our presentation into a series of what we call object stories. And the first of these object stories is called A Lady's Slipper from Vindolanda. Part of the story of how Roman imperial policy impacted the lives of women can be told by this single object that you now see on the screen. A woman's open-toed thong sandal found in the Roman fort at Vindolanda in northern England. Although open-toed thong sandals had existed in the Mediterranean world for centuries, in the 7th century BCE, Etruscan shoemakers elevated the simple, practical design by producing it in leather. Earlier examples of this type of footwear had been largely made from less durable, less valuable materials, such as palm fiber. And this is particularly typical of sandals found in Egypt, for instance. Etruscan sandals, or sandalia tyrenica as they were known in Greek, were all the rage in 5th century Athens, a kind of fashion hub of the ancient world, where they often featured golden gilded straps. Thus, these simple everyday shoes acquired a certain aura and were transformed into luxury objects. This continued to be true in the Roman Empire. In fact, the Edict of Diocletian, a 4th century list of maximum prices for goods and services issued by the emperor, placed shoes whose leather had been either treated with colored dyes or adorned with gold among its most expensive items. It is clear then that the stylish open-toed thong sandal from Vindolanda and its now lost companion would have been considered a chic, costly form of footwear. A seal on the shoe's insole identifies its maker as Lucius Aebutius Thales, son of Titus, an artisan thought to have been active in London or York, who traveled to sell his wares. It is also worth noting that when the Vindolanda sandal was produced and worn, such refined, expensive leather goods would have been a novelty in Roman Britain. The techniques of vegetable tanning were introduced to the native peoples of Northwest Europe through Roman occupation. Not only do leather goods first become visible in the archaeological record of Northwest Europe after the arrival of Roman troops, but local shoemaking is also affected by Roman practices. Sandals, especially women's sandals, are a clear mark of the widespread diffusion and rather rapid adoption of Mediterranean, Roman styles of footwear in the northern imperial provinces by the late 1st and early 2nd century CE. The extant architectural remains of the fort at Vindolanda conform to the standard format of Roman military camps throughout the empire. A rectangular enclosure divided into quadrants that housed administrative, residential, and service buildings. But what sets Vindolanda apart from all other archaeological sites is the unparalleled collection of everyday objects that has been preserved here. Thanks to the terrain's anoxic conditions, these are peat bogs that surround the site. In fact, the whole site is a peat bog. Materials such as wood and leather, which tend to disintegrate in other environments, have survived for hundreds of years at this particular spot. Wooden writing tablets, inkwells, spindle whorls, boxwood combs, textiles, the only extant horsehair crest from a Roman soldier's helmet, and thousands of shoes offer us a glimpse of what life would have been like during the fort's occupation. A charming postcard available for purchase at Vindolanda's museum shop offers a touching snapshot of life at this military camp through a suggestive selection of footwear. Moving clockwise from the top left, we see a soldier's boot, a baby's bootie, and I'm thinking of all the babies at the American Academy right now. We should reproduce these for them. A well-worn child's sock, and the elegant lady slipper I've been discussing with you. But who might have worn this black leather lady slipper from Vindolanda, and on what occasions? After all, an open-toed thong sandal would have been the most impractical form of footwear imaginable for a woman living on the northern edges of the Roman Empire. And for those of you who have visited Hadrian's Wall, you know what I'm talking about. It rains all the time, although I guess with climate change, things might change. But wet, damp, cold is the usual weather forecast for this region. More than 40 years ago, Robin Burley identified the owner of the black leather slipper from Vindolanda as Sulpicia Lepidina, the wife of Flavius Cerialis, who was the commanding officer at this fort about a decade after it was built. Snippets of Cerialis' life and that of his family have been preserved through letters written on the wooden tablets unearthed at Vindolanda. These missives record multiple exchanges by different individuals that touch on a variety of topics, ranging from business-like requests for provisions to more personal communications that shed light on the social and familial bonds that drew together the members of this community. One such missive is the so-called birthday letter, which you see here, addressed to Lepidina and signed by Claudia Severa, the wife of another military commander stationed at Briga, a nearby camp. And this is what the letter says. So, Claudia Severa, to her Lepidina, greetings. On September 11th, sister, for the day of the celebration of my birthday, I give you a warm invitation to make sure that you come to us to make the day more enjoyable for me by your arrival, if you're present. Give my greetings to your Cerialis. My Aelius and my little son send him their greetings. And then the first part of the letter is written by a professional scribe. So there's one hand. And this professional scribe is most likely a slave. And then Claudia Severa writes a shorter note in her own hand, a more emotional, more affectionate address. I shall expect you, sister. Farewell, sister, my dearest soul, as I hope to prosper and hail. And then in the back of the letter, the same professional scribal handwriting has the address, right? To Sulpicia Lepidina, wife of Cerialis, from Severa. Claudia Severa's missive to her friend Lepidina is an absolutely astounding discovery. It is first and foremost a rare example of an imperial period Latin text composed by a non-elite, otherwise unknown woman that is addressed to another, likewise non-elite, unknown woman. Given how seldom we encounter women's voices in Latin literary and epigraphic sources, the unquestionable authorship of this letter along with its contents, are enough to stop us in our tracks. Severa's birthday party may well have been the kind of occasion for which shoes like the black leather sandal from Vindolanda were made. And it is quite possible, as Burley suggested, that Lepidina was the woman who once wore it. But the presence of this delicate, ornate sandal and this moving letter in the archaeological remains at Vindolanda point to something far greater than the possible connection between a particular object and an individual. The Vindolanda tablets and the footwear unearthed at the site lend concrete, palpable form to an aspect of Roman military conquest that is often overlooked, namely the domestic life of soldiers and their families. In this more private realm of life at the empire's frontier, we see a female social network that develops and operates parallel to the male public network of military officers and their subordinates. Moreover, the correspondence between Lepidina and Severa highlights the relative freedom and mobility enjoyed by military wives who accompany their husbands to these far-flung outposts. Regular visits to each other's homes at different camps would have been an important way of attenuating the solitude and isolation of living on the very edges of the known world. They were also an important way of building, nurturing, and expanding the personal and familial bonds that shape these women's individual lives and rooted their families to the foreign lands they now called home. Lepidina's sandals may be seen then as agents of Romanization. They were active elements in the complex process of disseminating and reproducing key Roman institutions in remote territories. After all, imperial conquest involved not just the violent subjugation of other peoples, that was definitely a big part of it, but it also involved their transformation into subjects who were cognizant of Roman law, religion, and of course fashion. More than just a detachable and discardable good, the black leather woman's sandal from Vindolanda was an important type of fashioning, that is, a materialization of what it meant to be Roman, that molded the wearer's body and restrained her gait so that she became the very embodiment of an ideal Roman wife. All right.
Speeding forward 2,000 years. 15 gowns. So I'm going to talk about this exhibition, Charles James Beyond Fashion, which was an exhibition at the Met. It was based in the acquisition of almost 600 dresses by Charles James by the Met from the Brooklyn Museum. The exhibition was curated by the former head of the Costume Institute, Harold Coda, and supported by their extensive curatorial and conservation team. And it featured 16 dresses by Charles James produced from 1920 until his death in 1978. And the main gallery displayed 15 of his most influential and ambitious gowns produced during the late 40s and early 50s. Charles James was one of fashion's kind of hidden figures of deep influence. He was English, but he worked primarily in America, in Chicago and in New York. And Christian Dior, Yves Saint Laurent, Cristobal Balenciaga, all attributed his work as the source and primary influence for the New Look, which was a widely prevalent style that shaped mid-century American and Europe couture and ready-to-wear. He worked almost exclusively for independent clients, and while hungry to achieve popular success and visibility, he never managed to create a successful label or market brand. But he was an incredibly dexterous and influential tailor and considered a visionary. And he considered himself an artist, and he used the metaphor of architecture and of language to describe his work, because he was obsessed with creating a credo for fashion, a kind of universal methodology to establish its value and credibility in the world. And when he died in the Chelsea Hotel, his archives and writings were filled with that work, which was his kind of field theory of fashion. And so this exhibition was really about peeling back the layer of the mediated image of fashion, the mass image of fashion, to look at the designer and the tailoring and the language and construction of these objects to really pay regard to this methodology. So cut and dressmaking is like grammar and language. A good design should be like a well-made sentence, and it should only show and express one idea at a time. So we based the premise of the design of this exhibition, its presentation to the public, on this Cecil Beaton image of a group of women dressed in Charles James's gowns that appeared in Vogue magazine in 1946. It was at a point of departure. So instead of recreating this image of 50s glamour, we set aside the scenography, we set aside the social history in the image to really analyze this methodology like a set of art objects, and to do that through an intense investigation of the dresses, his writings, and personal effects. We arranged these 15 gowns in one of the main galleries, primary galleries in the Met, instead of in an organic kind of scenographic arrangement in this kind of shifted modernist grid, so that the full array of these gowns could be seen in all of their kind of specificity and in their kind of physical beauty. But the fact is that the analogy that drove us to this direction was that the collection, when we received it, was not in very good condition, and it also occupied this nebulous status that I think many fashion objects do, and particularly these, was that it was too familiar and, for instance, not familiar enough. So because the style of the dresses had been so replicated and so circulated, they felt common, they felt old-fashioned, they were kind of desaturated of ideas and relevance, and consequently devalued. So over time, the innovation of their construction, their tailoring, the design was inaccessible. It just really wasn't available to a viewer anymore. So our goal was really to reinvest these objects of their grandeur and their kind of aura, while at the same time really excavating the ambition and the detail of how they were constructed and made of James' design. The structure and the form, their construction, their draping, their historical references, their manipulations of the codes of dress design and fashion, and the choices that made them really unique and original in their time. So when you move through this exhibition, after you've seen that kind of image, you turn around and every gown is accompanied by this kind of technical armature, a camera, a probe that basically, and I'm sorry I don't have video of this, but moves around each object, which follows all the seams, which investigates the draping, which moves inside the garments, and actually videos and analyzes the interiors of these garments and makes it visible on the screens to the viewers. And here you see it again. So there was this very this intentionality to apply this metaphor of architecture to these gowns, and this was the intention of Charles James from the beginning, to sort of apply the kind of methodology and sort of acquire the stature of architecture for fashion. So we actually 3D scanned all these dresses, and we applied these kind of technology, architectural rendering technology, to kind of visualize the construction and the volume of these dresses. So this is just a little sample of each one of the, a few of the screens that tell these stories in more detail to really help you see inside the objects through this kind of technical eye. Not sure why the center one isn't going. There we go. Just to give you a moment to see these. So the goal of this was to really sort of reinvest these objects of both their aura and also their innovation and their kind of technical prowess. But another really important part of the design of this exhibition and the way that the objects were presented is very much about the context of this exhibition, not in the basement of the Costume Institute, but outside within the museum and the main galleries and outside the context of the Greek and Roman galleries, among a lot of the references from which James took so much influence and inspiration. Back to sandals.
And back in time. So in this particular object story, I'm moving away from thinking about a concrete object, an actual archaeological artifact like the shoe in Vindolanda, to thinking more about the representation of such artifacts, of such objects like shoes, jewelry, clothing in Roman art, in Greek and Roman art. So hence Aphrodite's sandal. The transformation of open-toed thong sandals into luxury objects in the late Archaic and early Classical period impacted not only the lives of the historical individuals who wore them, but also the ways in which ancient artists imagined and visualized the immortal gods. Beginning in the 5th century BCE, open-toed thong sandals became a favorite form of footwear for Greek deities. So much so that in 1985, Catherine Morrow published a typology of open-toed thong sandals as they were presented in classical Greek, Hellenistic, and Roman sculpture. On the left, you see one of these illustrations from Morrow's book, in which she delineates this typology and chronology of Greek and Roman depictions of open-toed thong sandals. And I absolutely love this book. It's in my Carrel in the library here if you guys want to check it out. There are pages and pages like this. And what Morrow is trying to do is to show that we can actually date the sculptures that survive from the classical Hellenistic and Roman period by looking at the style, at the design of the sandals that are worn by these various divine figures in these various works of art throughout the Mediterranean. It's an interesting thesis. I'm not entirely sure that I buy it, but the illustrations are amazing. On the right, you see a fragment of a colossal marble statue of a goddess wearing this particular type of footwear. This fragment was found in the archaeological area of Larg, Argentina, here in Rome, and it is dated to the 2nd century BCE. And you can see this fragment and other fragments of this colossal statue in the Stazione Monte Martini. So, I encourage you to go look at this thing. It's really quite amazing. It is huge. In any case, although in the classical period both male and female deities were represented wearing open-toed thong sandals, in later Hellenistic art, they only appear on female figures. And among these, no goddess is as intimately associated with this type of shoes as Aphrodite. One of the most popular iconographic types for Aphrodite is the so-called sandal binder. Produced throughout the Mediterranean from the late 3rd century BCE to the 4th century CE in a variety of media, almost all extant iterations of this composition are smaller than life size. Although there are some variations to Aphrodite's pose, the type is recognizable by her gesture of adjusting a piece of footwear that could be either carved, painted, or added to the sculpture, depending on the materials used by the artist. In an exquisite, well-preserved example now in the British Museum, which you see now on the screen, we see the goddess in the act of tying, or possibly untying, her sandal. As she reaches for the strap on her raised left foot with her right hand, Aphrodite turns her head to the side, creating a graceful chiasmus. A strut composed of several attributes, a swan, a ship's rudder, and the goddess's draped garments, anchors Aphrodite's acrobatic pose and communicates to the viewer that she's no mere mortal. The iconographic matrix for the sandal binder is, of course, Praxiteles' Aphrodite of Cnidos. Dated to the 4th century BCE, this now lost work of art was one of the most famous sculptures in antiquity. Thought to be the earliest large-scale female nude in Greek art, its impact on contemporary and subsequent representations of this goddess is difficult to overstate. Although Praxiteles' original has been lost for centuries, numerous surviving versions of the Cnidia attest to the reuse of key compositional elements that hark back to his invention: the left turn of the head, the goddess's faint smile, her slender back, a small water jar, and the ambiguous gesture of either lifting or putting down drapery. A comparison between a Roman-era sculpture of the Cnidia, now in the Vatican Museums, and the Vatican Museums, and the sandal binder from Knossos highlights the ways in which this later sculptural type responds to Praxiteles' creation. The stillness of the Cnidia's pose contrasts with the sandal binder's dynamic gesture, and while the statuette from Knossos features a pile of discarded clothing that recalls the Praxitelean design, it is not so much the absence of the goddess's dress, but the presence of her shoe that lends interest to this composition. In both images, bathing serves as a narrative frame for the goddess's nudity. Yet, in the case of the sandal binder, that frame is somewhat incongruous, for why would Aphrodite be concerned with her footwear when she has nothing else on? The banality of the sandal binder's gesture lends this figure an amusing everyday aura, but is her playfulness an indication that images of the sandal binder were essentially unserious, charming trinkets for refined connoisseurs? Or did these images, like Praxiteles' Cnidia, itself a revered cult statue in antiquity, evoke a wide range of responses from viewers? In other words, what did the sandal binder mean, and to whom did she speak? Was she just a titillating image designed to draw a prurient male gaze? Or did she, like the Cnidia herself, also speak to female viewers and worshippers who saw in Aphrodite a potential guardian and ally capable of granting them safety at sea, sexual desirability, and fertility? In order to answer these questions, I would like to shift our attention back to the Roman world. Most of the surviving examples of the sandal binder date to the Roman period, a fact that points to the long-lasting popularity of the sculptural type, but that also demands that we consider what happens to these images as they move from Greece to Rome, and Aphrodite becomes Venus. So here we're going to begin to explore this idea of translation, right? So translation from Greece to Rome. As the iconography of the sandal binder traveled west from Greece to Rome, it was continuously adapted and modified, a transformation or translation that is especially evident through the different attributes that come in and out of the composition depending on the context. First, we see a great variation in the types of additional accessories that adorn the bodies of Roman sandal binders. They tend to be cleaner in the Hellenistic period, and as you move forward in time and into the imperial period, the more bedecked and bejeweled they become, which is a reminder that for the Romans, more is always more as an aesthetic. Less is never more. More is always more. So these are very much in that spirit. Okay, first we see, right, the variation of additional accessories that adorn the bodies of the Roman sandal binders. And in some cases, we also see how the iconography is transformed through the expansion and incorporation of several companions. So all of a sudden, the single figure becomes this kind of multi-figural iconography. On the screen, you see two examples of Roman sandal binders from the Bay of Naples. On the left, you see a marble statuette found in Pompeii, and on the right, you see a bronze figurine from Herculaneum. While the image on the right emphasizes Venus' maritime connections through the figure of a dolphin, you can see him sort of wrapped up in this kind of rod that is supporting the acrobatic gesture of that particular sandal binder. The strut that we saw in the previous example has been taken away, so she seems like she's floating in the air. It must be a rather uncomfortable and precarious position. So there is the dolphin trying to hold her up, right? And on the left, we see a statue that shows the goddess surrounded by extra mythological figures, a Cupid who helps support her left foot, and a Priapus who is depicted as a miniature sculpture with his own column-like base. The sandal binder from Pompeii is also unique because she comes from a well-documented archaeological context that helps us understand the audience for which she was made. This Pompeian sandal binder was unearthed in 1954, during the excavations of a small house situated along the town's main street, the so-called Via dell'Abbondanza, which you see on the right. The work is competently carved and is typical of first-century Campanian workshops that produced similar sculptures for local, quote-unquote, middle-class patrons. The most remarkable feature of the sandal binder is, however, her elaborate gold ensemble, which in addition to her signature footwear includes 2 anklets, 2 bracelets, 2 armbands, a necklace, a long X-shaped chain, a bra, and a pair of briefs. The striking similarity between the sandal binder's outfit and a woman's 2-piece swimsuit, a type of garment that had been invented, or more precisely reinvented, in 1946, led to the house's modern name, the House of Venus in a Bikini. But in the mid-20th century, bikinis were still seen as risque, a fact that inevitably colored early interpretations of this Pompeian sandal binder and the building in which she was found. Matteo della Corte, a rather controversial figure in Pompeian archaeology, just ask Evan Jewell about him, he will tell you all about it, right? Somebody who should have been really a novelist and not an archaeologist, very active imagination. Anyway, Matteo della Corte described this house as a high-class brothel, casting a lurid light on its decor and inhabitants. But what did Venus' resplendent form of dress mean for first-century Roman viewers? Were bikinis also associated with prostitution in the minds of Roman men and women? What stories did this Pompeian sandal binder embody in the context of this Roman house? And for those of you, I imagine most of you have been to Pompeii, this house looks exactly like every other Pompeian house. Had this sandal binder not been found in this place, Matteo della Corte would never have interpreted the site as a brothel. And even if they had found a sandal binder and she had not been wearing a bikini, he probably wouldn't have said that this house is a brothel. So there's nothing really here that tells us that this was a site of prostitution, okay? Except for Matteo della Corte's interesting interpretation. Okay. While literary and artistic evidence suggests that breast bands, fasciae, were commonly used by Roman women, far less is known about underpants, subligacula, a great Roman Latin word. Rarely mentioned by Latin authors, women's briefs were long thought to have been worn solely by menstruating women. The discovery of several leather briefs dating to the Roman imperial period in London in the early 20th century attests to the existence of this type of clothing in antiquity, but tells us very little about who might have worn them and on what occasion. Some scholars have argued that these intimate pieces of clothing belonged to lower-class entertainers such as prostitutes, dancers, and acrobats who made a living from displaying and selling their bodies. But clothes that were considered racy on their own might have seemed perfectly acceptable if used as undergarments. Moreover, the context in which a Roman quote-unquote bikini was worn would have been key to understanding its function and significance. For example, in 2 epigrams by Marshall, subligacula are referenced in relation to athletic activities taking place in a Roman bath, while the exceptionally modest Chione is said to wear briefs when she bathes, the lusty Philinus dons them to play ball. A well-known 4th century mosaic from a splendid Roman villa in Sicily lends further credence to the idea that bikinis, made either of leather or another type of fabric, were worn by women participating in sporting events. But whether the scene depicted professional athletes in a gymnasium or amateurs exercising in private, the presence of this mosaic in an upper-class Roman home shows that representations of bikini-wearing women were not always seen as scandalous in the Roman period. Similar to our own contemporary images of women in swimwear and lingerie, Roman depictions of women in bikinis evoked ideas related to physical beauty, sexual desire, and fertility, especially when Venus was the one portrayed sporting this type of clothing. Equally significant is the sandal binder's long X-shaped chain that she wears over her torso. Known as a kastos in Greek and as a catena in Latin, this type of jewelry carried a strong erotic connotation in the ancient Mediterranean world. In the classical period, maidens were often depicted in Greek vases and funerary reliefs wearing these narrow crossbands over their clothes. As Mireille Lee has noted, this type of ornament had both a practical and a symbolic function. Like a charioteer's shoulder straps, these X-shaped chains kept one's garments from billowing away from the body. but in doing so, they also rendered a woman's clothes more form-fitting, emphasizing and framing her breasts. Because these objects simultaneously contained a woman's clothed body and enhanced its sensuality, they were often used as amulets that both protected the wearer and rendered her more desirable. Furthermore, their association with young girls on the cusp of maturity indicates that this type of necklace could also have signaled a woman's virgin status and her potential for marriageability. The casta's magic and erotic associations also made it a fitting attribute for Aphrodite, and later, of course, for Venus. For first-century women viewers in the house of Venus in a bikini, the sandal binder's catena would have served as a physical, tangible link between this goddess and themselves. Among the many victims of Vesuvius eruption, whose remains were excavated in Pompeii, Herculaneum, and Atlantis, several women were found carrying long gold chains, either on their bodies or in their purses. Clearly, for these individuals, their catenae were among their most precious possessions, which they took with them as they attempted to escape an unforeseen natural disaster. Whether these chains were worn over a woman's clothes or directly on her body in moments of intimacy, it is evident that they would have been recognized and prized by Roman women for their erotic charge and venereal associations that might have to do with marriage rituals and ceremonies, or more simply, with the desire to be desired. The Pompeian sandal binder's elaborate gold ensemble ought to be understood then as a collection of miniature everyday items that replicate actual objects which were owned and worn by Roman women and not just by prostitutes. A form of ex voto, the sandal binder's golden ensemble is also a testament to the devotion and affection directed toward this image by the members of this household. Placed on the altar-like structure in the house's atrium, this image of Venus would have been at the very center of the social and religious activities that took place in the space. Here, the sandal binder became the physical, material embodiment of numerous interwoven stories. Stories of prosperity and conspicuous consumption, stories of religious piety, but also stories of desire and even of tenderness. After all, Venus is here portrayed not just as a sensual and bejeweled deity, but also as a mother. She is accompanied by two of her children, Cupid and Priapus, so we can imagine this as a kind of family portrait. Before I turn the mic over to Susan, and to sort of facilitate the travel and time back to the 21st century, I want to leave you with one last set of images. We often say that history repeats itself, but as Harold Coda once noted, in the history of fashion, references are not just reiterated, they are tumbled and assimilated. In summer 2021, the American jewelry brand By Shari launched a gold body chain named after Hailey Bieber, who is seen here modeling the piece for their website. By Shari, by the way, is the brand that was made famous in 2020 by Michelle Obama's Vote necklace, right? It was because of Michelle Obama's Vote necklace that a lot of us became aware of this designer. Anyway, this piece was advertised as the it piece for the summer. By Shari's body chain promised its potential buyers and wearers to become as desirable as the Nereid-like Mrs. Bieber. The ad read, "Embellished with freshwater pearls and totally unique, you'll be turning heads all season long in the Hailey body chain." This, of course, struck me as being very Roman. Whether or not Sherry Cuthbert, the chain's designer, knew of the existence of Roman catena and Pompeii's Venus in a bikini, she and her marketing team knew quite well how to speak to their customers through the language of objects. All right, and now back to Susan.
So I'm also going to move to representation and the space in which objects are often interpreted in fashion. And if the James exhibition analyzed fashion in detail using this kind of technical eye to see into these objects, this project is an exercise to kind of contextualize luxury fashion from the outside in, to bring kind of the complicated, contradictory underbelly of fashion into the sanitized environment and highly edited environment of the luxury boutique, and sort of engage its denizens in what's been edited or hidden from that experience. This was and is a collaboration with Prada to serially transform their flagship store on the corner of Broadway and Prince in New York City. And this space was originally designed by Rem Koolhaas. The central premise originally was to increase the kind of responsiveness, the speed, and the sort of relevance of the architecture through this kind of graphic intervention of this city block long wall that runs the line of the store. And also to integrate the kind of ethos and aesthetics of a more populous realm of the street into this kind of design space, to probe kind of the conflicts and the internal dramas and the external drivers of fashion and the luxury market and its clientele. It was, again, this exercise in making the invisible visible. And so it engages the kind of murky territories of consumerism, its mechanics and apparatus, the social construction of femininity, its conflicts and contradictions, its fantasies and social imaginaries. And for us, this has become this kind of 20-year exploration and sketch process into the ways that graphic language can give form to these issues. The original wallpaper is this one. It happened to be called Prada Vomit. The original wallpaper was conceived as a kind of integral part of the store's architecture, and it since then has been basically produced 2 or 3 times a year. The work often migrates to other locations and venues, to runway shows, to events, and it's been integrated into textiles, into the collections itself. And it usually starts with a prompt from a particular collection, and it takes off from there. So Mrs. Prada is very involved in the process of thinking about these and commenting on our sketch process. And this a prompt for one of these might be, in quotes and verbatim, a little bit 20s, a little bit 60s, a little bit Russian woman on a horse. But this inaugural wallpaper, as I said, was called Prada Vomit. It was the city block long non-repeating pattern, which layers this kind of florid screen over a patchwork of pixelated stills of almost 300 videos that we made with the OMA team to explore and interrogate the space of shopping. So this was like from logistics on factory floors and in distribution spaces and stock rooms, to browsing, to women's experience of shopping, browsing in dressing rooms, squeezing ourselves into clothing that doesn't fit, buying fakes on Canal Street, shopping online, as a way to survey the full realm of fashion's lived experience and to give it a space in this kind of sanctified space of the luxury boutique. The store was imagined as a kind of stage and a performance with both the sales force and shoppers as a kind of actors in this drama. This was also realized in small videos that streamed this content, featuring these kind of alternative realities that were sort of integrated into the product displays and among the garments on the racks. So the wallpaper here is this kind of metaphor for, it's an object itself, of course, and it also creates a context for these objects. It acts as a kind of metaphor for ephemerality, for temporality. It's a surface, not a structure. And in the context of architectural and design discourse, that's a kind of, a kind of maligned space that's been undervalued and viewed as kind of inauthentic adornment or as superficial. But here it also serves as a kind of window or screen into these infinite worlds that fashion both shapes and reflects beyond this context. And this is an effort to kind of create this conceptual, physical, psychic leap between fashion and consumerism and the experiences and the social imaginaries of its audience and communities. The trajectory of this project was, and it continues to be, to kind of probe the space, to surface and give form to the polemics of fashion through graphic language. So I'm going to just go through many of these just quickly and give you a sense of this kind of exploration from, let's say, then until now. This next iteration is called Protopixel. It speaks to the kind of idea of the imaginary masses that are sort of receiving these kinds of images that are broadcast through the fashion system, hypothetically. And this is an image that was originally derived from the public spectacles and stadiums, for instance, in North Korea. All individuals holding up individual cards that serve as pictols to create this kind of large-scale mass image, mass kind of hegemonic image. And it's also it kind of echoes an image that we saw in Urana's presentation yesterday in her shop talk. But this, you see this repetition iterated in this kind of army of mannequins, and the mannequins were collected from all different regions of the world, so they embody often kind of a kind of eclecticism that, let's say, disrupts the sort of ordinary blank signifier of the mannequin, which is a kind of artifice to draw our attention away from individual women, actually, and users, and to the commodity or product itself. So there was this idea to kind of create more difference. And then these characters and shoppers were then, again, streamed through these windows, these screens, in among the garments to create this kind of intimate engagement with these alternative figures in this experience. This new cast of characters was, streamed through the garments, injecting these intimate moments. And this repetition and this kind of transfiguration from similarity to difference is echoed from the wallpaper to this display to the street to create this kind of connection with the endless stream of people, in this case coming out of the subway. So there's this effort to kind of disintegrate the boundaries of the store and the street and to create a much deeper kind of connection between what's going on in the shop and the consumers in the shop and everyday people. In this effort to, again, kind of explore the kind of mechanisms of the space, this is, we turned our eye to the idea of the systematic production of brand, creating this kind of global standard, graphic standards manual on the walls of the store to visualize the tools and the mechanics of the circulation and distribution of goods and ideas and ideologies in fashion. And then, to the kind of language of escapism to illustrate this kind of immersive fantasy of fashion, and also allude to its kind of pleasure, which is a really important and useful component of it. And as well to various archetypes of femininity and feminist ideals, so the classical body and the specter of classical ideals that haunt women's bodies, but alternatively, the cyborg, which is a more recuperative kind of contemporary model of identity. We also explored the idea of authenticity and femininity through the lens of iconic paintings, recreating these beautiful fragments that were painted in a small village in mainland China that's completely devoted to the craft of reproduction. So for us, this questions the kind of the cultural authority and the uses of these types of images. And this collage, which is the full length of the block, it's made of these actual works, and so they're actual paintings with, you can see every brushstroke and the way the colors combine, and they're just incredibly beautifully crafted. So this contrast between this kind of exquisite handmade execution with the replication and the imagery itself calls into question what's authentic and what's fake, and if it matters. And that makes obvious commentary on luxury fashion, its value and its place in the market, but also on the construction of identity itself. We reflected on iconic women in history via these monumental portraits, hand-painted portraits of Cleopatra, of Madame Curie. And we sometimes go in and we edit or we erase or we redact these images or mask them to alter their interpretations. We're interested in sort of recuperating the representation of fashion and to assert fashioning, as Hérica talks of, as a kind of creative, constructive, expressive, and empowering kind of sphere rather than an empty, trivial, or superficial one, a space that we can kind of play out new, empowering social imaginaries. This is a more recent piece that we did exploring the archives of historic women comic artists, We also commissioned several contemporary women artists to create this cast of women superheroes, to, in a way, kind of visualize this idea of creating and shaping women's power. And this is one of the projects that kind of extends to all these different types of spaces. So, to the runway, to the street, to social media, to extend this kind of critical dialogue. This is very rough because it's ordinarily, of course, on your phone. And then much more recent, this example that's called Mute, which visualizes the kind of hyper-replication and the total saturation of fashion identity and brand in the space of social media. It's kind of both aesthetic and also oppressive excess. But ultimately for us, fashion has served as this kind of endless opportunity to explore objects, their underlying narratives, to explore fashion, but also to design itself in the ways that we might excavate, reveal, explore their meanings, and disrupt kind of dominant readings or interpretations. And on a last note, this was a piece which is a kind of temporal, consummately ephemeral wallpaper, this projection map, so to speak, which is, it dynamically displays the AP wire streamed over a moving body of a runway model, literally kind of defining her body. And it really embodies the apotheosis of this strategy to kind of read the current cultural moment through fashion and the embellishments and adornments of women's bodies. So we end here to sit and have a conversation.
Thank you both very much.
Thank you.
Okay, let's turn the lights back on. Thank you both for incredibly interesting and well cross-fertilized presentations. I'm going to throw out a question and then we'll turn to the audience. I'd like to ask both of you maybe to say a little bit more about the work that the objects do, say, in comparison to other sources, or what can we learn about women's lives from some of the objects that we saw, sort of pushing that idea of the social role of the objects a little bit more.
Are you asking me or are you asking
I'm
Susan?
Yeah.
Do you want to start?
Sure, I can start. I guess for me, why this medium is interesting is because it is, I think, this really active area where women are working all the time, and that it's, a lot of the work that I showed is actually quite old. I feel like it's really this space, it's an incredibly active way of shaping our kind of contemporary notions of gender and power, and it's all around us, and it's shaped, it's considerably different even now, it moves very quickly. So for me, that's really why I pursue the work and why I think it's useful. And I guess simultaneously, it's also a way to sort of critique and reflect my own discipline, reflect on my own discipline, and the kind of, the dominant areas of study and the languages that are, kind of lauded or that are given kind of value. So I'm interested in re-investigating that and sort of hoping to reshape that.
So I'm thinking about the social role of objects, right? And I think sort of social history, social art history is not new in and of itself. It's something that we've been engaged in now for several decades. Can you hear me? Is this on? Okay. But I think what I'm trying to do is sort of build on that model, right, by sort of shifting it around a little bit, shifting it towards women, not just as subjects, but as agents, right? So one of the things that focusing on objects of daily life that were produced for women in the Roman Empire allows me to do is to ask questions that highlight the agency of women, where they're not just being seen as passive objects, right, or passive participants in a process, but rather as active agents that have choice, that have a voice, but also by re-excavating the contexts in which these objects are found and how they're interpreted, right? So if we look back at, this kind of controversy about, what was the function of that house in which the sandal binder was found, if you sort of go back to think about the sandal binder in that context, and you read through the archive of those excavations, you begin to see a whole lot more about not just the women in that household, but the whole household as a group. So this is something that I couldn't really address in the talk, but the house yielded not only, obviously, this marvelous marble sculpture, but a number of other objects, including seal rings with the names of the owners of the house, and they have names that suggest that they were freedmen. There are also jewelry pieces that suggest that there was a presence of a woman, whether a sister or the wife of one of them. But very sort of traumatically for me, they also found chains that were clearly used also for restraining the movement of slaves in the household, right? So we get a sense of, individuals that have risen above a certain station, right? They now have this respectable house that looks very much like the other sort of what we call sort of middle-class houses in Pompeii. And it's a mixed bag of evidence, right? On one hand, these objects allow us to see this house for what it was, and some of it is less lurid than a brothel, but it also reveals the complicated reality of domestic life in the Roman Empire in all of its facets, right? So does that give you a sense of?
Thank you both for that. I will turn it over to the audience now. Do we have questions from the audience? Oh, yes, back.
So to thank you both for that talk.
Sarah.
I have a question. Let me try to sort of unpack it. Hérica, I thought you did a really nice job, as I know, and like studies of the Roman house, they very much focus on like the male client or the male homeowner, and you brought up sort of female subjectivity and different female viewers. And then I think of fashion, Susan, as this is always this question: who do you dress for? Like, are these images advertising to women or men or things like that? But can you both take that kind of question, because women came up a lot in this, and do these, I guess, what am I trying to say? Do you think the images advertise more to a specific sex or to a specific class more than anything? Because I'm thinking about Prada images, like I cannot access that. I'm sort of left out of that conversation. And with your stature, you're in the house, Hérica, I'm thinking about is that I'm coming in. Maybe my reaction to that piece and what I see in there and what I might hope to have is going to be very different, not so much based on my sex, but my class. So can you talk a little bit about those things are like interrelated?
Absolutely. This is a really good question, Sarah, that goes really to the heart of what I'm trying to do, right? In trying to ask new questions and tell new stories, I immediately am confronted with the fact that on one hand, these objects can be read positively, right, as a sign of empowerment for women, especially women of a certain class. I'm thinking, of course, for instance, the military wives, the wives of the military commanders who are sort of the top rank of that local community, right? And you're absolutely right that, the sandal binder, Aphrodite, Venus statue in the house in Pompeii would have most likely, we can't really know all of their subjectivities, but we imagine that people of different classes, whether you were a slave or freed, right, whether you were of a certain social class, you would respond differently to this image. What I think is slightly different, slightly different from the discussion of contemporary haute couture now, is that Venus is, of course, she is everywhere, right? Not just in the Roman world, but in the Mediterranean, and there are many aspects of Venus, Aphrodite, right? She has other names like Astarte, Ishtar, right? So this figure of this goddess that is related to motherhood, to sexuality, to fertility, to desirability, but also these sort of aquatic marine connections. This is a figure that is part of the Mediterranean religious cult history, right? And so in some ways she is accessible, right, to a very wide audience, right? And all of the objects that she's shown wearing, right? It is true that some of them would have been made in very expensive, precious materials, gold, gems, but we also know somebody was, it was somebody else, not here at the Academy at the moment, but somebody else was talking to me about her interest in the way in which all of this jewelry, right, is reproduced already in the Roman world in cheaper materials that would have been accessible to a much wider audience, right? So glass, bronze, iron, so there's a kind of similarity in shape to these objects, even though they're being produced for different audiences and different customers in a variety of materials. Does that answer at least the ancient part of the question?
Yeah.
The more contemporary version is a little bit trickier, but I do think obviously, like the work I'm doing isn't really history, so it's not about sort of fleshing out a kind of historical narrative and providing like an alternative through trying to kind of recuperate narratives from, people that haven't really been heard somehow because the objects haven't been found or because the objects haven't been kind of elevated and read. And that's one thing that's really struck me, Hérica, about your presentation is that, it is very much about the pre-existing interpretations are very specific. They're maybe much more about the reader and the period than they are necessarily about the objects themselves. So you're bringing this very fresh perspective to it, and also the level of detail at which you look at them and the kind of, you just give like a tremendous amount of care and sort of tenderness to, these things. And I think that that's clearly something that is missing in the discipline, but also really gives a kind of much more kind of nuanced, textured picture of the period, as you say. It changes our nation, gives us kind of a more complicated, rich, and deep perspective of how empire is shaped, and the vehicles for that, and also demonstrates a different type of history, a different way of writing, of seeing, of analyzing objects. So I really appreciate that. And I can't argue for Prada that it isn't in many ways shaped to speak to a certain class of women, but in some ways I think that's quite elastic in kind of contemporary culture, because there's so many ways that we access the discourses of fashion and even the products of fashion now through social media, through the Real, or through sharing objects, and
Not to mention the fakes, the replications.
right, exactly, the replications, and those things can be, and that's in a way our point of focusing on what is authentic and inauthentic, or what is fake or not fake. Does it matter? Because we're all doing this, and we're all, these images are influencing what we're thinking and feeling about ourselves, and we're in turn using these objects in however ways, and whatever way we can access them to, illustrate ourselves to ourselves and of course to other people. So, that's really my interest in this project, and I do think that also all of the people that are involved in the industry and the kind of craft and the art of fashion are obviously hugely diverse, and so there's so many points of access and ways that people are thinking about this way and using this as a tool to both analyze and critique culture and identity in the ways that we, shape, and they're shaped by external forces.
I think the case of Prada also to recuperate fashion as something that is made by women for, it is,
for
so
sure,
much about
yeah.
Prada, whether we can buy it or not, whether we can actually afford it or not, right?
Yeah.
So much of what drives the design and the thinking behind it and the work that you've been doing for them is this idea that it is fashion by women, for women, that plays with this contradiction of, who are women dressing up for, but also really highlights the pleasure of fashion, right? And this is something that I also have been trying to do in my work to, you mentioned this sort of, I do have this love for these objects. These are complicated objects. I love the Roman Empire, complicated period of history, but, I am endlessly fascinated by it, and I'm always trying to excavate this, this is part of my obsession with it, is sort of think about the Roman Empire from these other unseen or unexplored corners. So, my first book was about tenderness, not an emotion that people associate with the Romans very often. And now I am thinking about fashion, but thinking about fashion in a way that tries to recuperate women's voices in the Roman Empire through the objects or through the other objects that create a context, like the not the love letter, sorry, the letters, or the birthday letter from Vindolanda, right? And so I think that's another sort of connection between our work. I also have this sort of funny idea that in a way I'm doing the work that archaeologists 2,000 years from now will be doing with the archive that is left of Prada objects, like 2,000 years from now in the American Academy in Rome, there will be somebody working through the Prada archive trying to figure out, who was this for? What were the stories in these objects?
Okay, we're going to take 2 more questions. This was such a rich conversation. Preeti, and then the gentleman in the back.
So my question is for Susan. I'm not sure if I can articulate it very quite clearly. I know that sort of wallpaper kind of thing that you made. You had, a larger kind of drawing and outline, and then photographs. Some of it was like this kind of difficulty, like one faces when one go, trying to fit into something smaller. Other things. So there was a certain kind of subtle critique going on as well. But there's a lot of your work which is actually for very high-end products. And so like Prada, whatever, when you have all of those mannequins facing you and you come out of a subway tired and sweaty,
Do you want to be confronted with someone's critique?
That's
a good question.
I'm just saying that like there's a way in which I think that like the thing about anything elite is actually about ease. And
I'm sorry, about what?
About is ease. And so the reason why you don't go into of these stores is because in 5 minutes they'll make you feel uncomfortable, right? There are always very few things. They come and they look you up and down. There's a way in which you run away. And so you kind of know that this is not for us. So I mean, you know that you're designing for these. So I wondered why this language of critique. There's a lot of language that you're using, or provenance and all that, which academics will use all the time, and it sounds very good. But you're actually designing. So in a way, why not embrace it and then actually talk about it in another way? Because it's a contradiction.
It is a total contradiction, and I think that is sort of one of the ways that I'm sort of investigating ideas through my work, and so it is something that I do. And I think you're right that in a way it isn't really something that necessarily speaks to all people, or that is, but I also think that there is a lot of that work that while we see the critique in it, I think a lot of people actually really just love it visually. And it is something that's like a beacon that people go to, and they want to be in that space and they want to see it. So I think that there is a little bit of flexibility in that language. Like, for instance, a lot of the ones that are more like the fantasy mural, or even the one of the classical bodies, and that actually was from like a runway campaign, and they were images that were, so it was kind of stuff that was out there and used, and we made them very big, and then we actually plastered around them to kind of silhouette around them. So they're kind of these really physical, beautiful images. So yes, they are critique, but I think we always try, and maybe some more so than others, to also kind of use this language of like things that are really beautiful and compelling and just intuitively attractive as a way to kind of bridge that gap between audiences. And it's interesting, maybe it's a little bit of a test, like, do you see this more as critique, or are you more attracted to this image? Because I think a lot of them are actually just really beautiful. And I think that they're like a kind of magnet that really does bring people off the street. But that more generally, that is kind of like a tension that I'm always trying to work with in my work, is a little bit like creating something that is open-ended in terms of interpretation, and that, yes, it brings up issues or ideas, it can be critique, but maybe sometimes it's also just, it's very compelling, it's very attractive. And I think we all struggle with those contradictions in ourselves too. So it's, I also, in a way, I want to try to normalize that in a way that we can acknowledge contradictions and difficulties and still acknowledge being attracted to something, wanting to participate in it, feeling, loving it. And I think that's what fashion is in a way, right? And so I think also a little bit, the standards manual is called Product Guilt, and it's a little bit like about like relinquishing that guilt and sort of like giving over to the pleasure of it too, that's okay.
Susan, I just want to throw something out there. As I was looking at the images of the store, it seemed like somewhere a hybrid of a store, a museum, a performance piece that you could be drawn in for the aesthetic experience without the expectation of buying something. Was that part of your
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I could attribute it to me because I wasn't the architect of the space, but I do think that was the intention of the space originally on the part of Office for Metropolitan Architecture of MCOL, so that it was like a public space. So the space is a corner, it's a corner of Prince and Broadway, and you can literally go in one side and walk through down this wave, that kind of wooden wave, and up the other side, and the idea was that it could be like an alternate passage in the street. It's raining, you want to stay dry, you can walk through the store. Actually, I have to say that is not the case now because of COVID, because now all these stores are kind of limiting and making people wait outside. And actually, Michael, my partner, and I were talking a little bit about it the other day, which is it still continues on, and frankly, these stores are not crowded. So it may be a little bit at this kind of effort to kind of reestablish exclusivity at this moment in time. I don't really know. But the store is also, in a way, it is a museum. It's also like a kind of social space, and it was really designed to be a kind of performance space and a stage. So this wooden wave in the middle of the space kind of starts off as the second floor and kind of becomes a kind of like stadium seating, and on the other side of the wave is a platform that opens. So it actually is a performance space and a lecture space, and it's open, for instance, for like Design Week and Fashion Week and different parties and events in the store. So that was an original conception of the store, and that was very perceptive. Wasn't what I was talking about, but yes, yeah.
We'll take a final question from the back.
Yeah, from the gentleman in the back.
Oh, I didn't see you, Tom. I don't have my glasses on.
It's all right. No, first I want to thank you for these dazzling presentations in every way. But I wanted to express this feeling of incredible cultural dissonance, having just returned from the Biennale, where women's bodies are also everywhere, and none of these bodies. They all are turning into animals. They are deconstructed, dismembered. It's as if at this moment, this world that you're describing and the art world of this moment are completely different universes. Or maybe I'm wrong about that, but it's certainly the feeling I get having come fresh from Venice. And the other thing is, I've been reading about a new translation of Ovid's Metamorphoses, in which every single one of these idealized female bodies was, if I think Ovid was testifying correctly, were the targets of rape, assault. And in our culture, in our time, what are these the targets of? It's beauty, but I'm finding it shocking, these two juxtapositions. Can you help me put those two things together?
I'm not sure that we can help you to put them together, but I have to say that I really agree with you, and I think it's obviously a really dark moment. And actually, I have to say a lot of this work in my effort to create a kind of conversation with Hérica and her work, like a lot of this work is actually older, and so there is a kind of like dissonance between like something like, even if it's critique and whatever, and it feels a little bit academic in this particular moment, I actually put in the one mural of the monumental women that then their faces get covered with the masks that then become patterned in almost intentionally, because that was a product of a very different time. And it was a kind of critique of the shrouding of women's faces, and a kind of question, and a kind of parallel right around, like, the apparatus of capitalism and consumerism, and the ways that that also kind of masks women and their specificity and their identity. But obviously that's like a much darker image right now, I think, and it borders on totally inappropriate, I have to say. I was like, this is, I mean, Eric and I talked about, this is really inappropriate, but I'm actually going to put it in because because this was about sort of bringing up, demonstrating contradictions and, letting this be kind of very multifaceted. And I was curious if someone would bring it up because I find it a really, in this moment in time, a deeply disturbing image actually in what's happening in the world. And I think that's also what's sort of also interesting and powerful about this kind of work is the way that it does change a lot and how we need to constantly like revisit and reassess based in the current moment. And I guess it sort of reflects on a little bit of the rigor that you need to have to really do that. And I would say sensitive and maybe that tenderness or care that I think that is demonstrated in Hérica's work, and sort of bravery to take that on too, because it's really is a very dark moment right now.
Thank you for the bravery. Tom, I think we have to have this conversation in various episodes over various meals. I'm not going to be able to answer all your questions or your question about the dissonance tonight. Couple of things that I can say. I think you're absolutely right that the way in which we imagine, visualize, and represent human bodies right now, male, female, in between, trans, is very different from what how the ancients saw the body, how they represented the body. And this is not to say that their sexuality was simpler or less complex than ours, but the visualization of those ideas, of those concepts, had a certain form, right? That has definitely informed the ways that we think of bodies to this very day, right, to this very century. But that, the ways in which we perceive our bodies, in which we represent our bodies, what we want to emphasize about sexuality in a given moment of history, of a particular culture, of a particular society, are constantly changing. The question of rape in Ovid, this is a huge, huge question that has had a long history of scholarship, of feminist scholarship, right, that has pointed to the extreme violence that underlies all this great Latin literature, especially of the early imperial period. My work, again, has been to try to recuperate something else, right? I think that those are narratives that are well known. This is not to say that the Roman Empire and the Roman society weren't violent. They were, but that's not just it, right? There are other stories, right? There are other narratives that are equally important, but that we tend to simplify antiquity by thinking of it as only violent, as only being a rape culture. And this is what I try to get my students to understand, that first of all, right, their attitudes towards rape, towards the body, what is permissible, what is not permissible, first of all, that is completely different from ours. I'm not saying it's right or wrong. I'm just saying that it's a whole different set of cultural attitudes towards sexuality, the body, etc. It is also only one facet of this really complex society that has also produced some of the most moving, most tender literature and art. And I think that a lot of my work has been to point to that other side, right? So that the past doesn't get discarded because it is perceived as only violent, as aggressive and negative. No, I know that's not what you're saying, but I'm just saying that this is my constant struggle. Every time I give a talk, there's somebody who's going to say, what about rape? I'm like, yes, it is an important topic. We've discussed this. We know this. This is not what I'm trying to talk about. I'm trying to talk about the fantasy that allowed these individuals to live in this very violent world, that allowed them to build identities and connections with one another, to idealize the possibility of a different life that was not so horrible, so brutish, and so short, right? So that's what I have for you right now. But we can continue talking about this.
We'll absolutely continue. I think this is where we'll have to stop on the idea of the contradictions a moment to think about contradictions as we await the news from the United States that will.
Well, speaking of, yes,
know.
we need these fantasies right now. you
Yeah,
know?
exactly. But a huge thank you to Susan and Eric.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
And please continue the conversation upstairs in the cortile. I know Esther has a question that she will ask. Come up and ask.